that mitosis is going to generate a primary oocyte. Okay, that primary oocyte site becomes surrounded by cells, and that combination of the primary oocyte and the surrounding cells makes up the primordial follicle. We talked about the fact that these primordial follicles undergo programming death early on during fetal life. But by the time a child reaches puberty, there may be around 300,000 of these primordial follicles. And each month, under the influence of FSH, one or more are stimulated to develop further. So that's what you see occurring right here. Okay? During this early development, the primary oocyte within the follicle remains in stage 1 meiosis. Remember, we said that was arrested in prophase. But the developing follicle continues to mature. Here, when we see an antrum, at that point it's called a secondary follicle. When the antrum grows and displaces the oocyte to one side, it's a mature secondary follicle, which we can call either a vesicular or graphene follicle. Okay? It's around this point that we get the LH surge at mid-cycle. We said the LH surge is going to do three things. Number one, it's going to trigger completion of meiosis 1. And that's what we see occurring over here. We see a little spindle forming where chromosomes are lining up in the center and dividing into two daughter cells, one of which becomes a secondary oocyte, the second of which becomes a first polar body. Okay? Now, the second thing LH does is it triggers ovulation. So that the oocyte that gets released is actually a secondary oocyte. That secondary oocyte, though, has begun meiosis 2, but that process gets arrested in metaphase, and it won't be completed unless fertilization occurs. Okay? Here we see a little spermatozoa coming along and performing fertilization. Okay? So, with that event, meiosis 2 gets stimulated, and then we produce two daughter cells, one of which is mature ovum, the second of which is the second polar body. In the meantime, the first polar body, if it's still alive, completes meiosis 2. So the process, oogenesis, leads to a single mature ovum and 3 polar bodies. And that's assuming that fertilization occurs. Okay. This is a slide that represents the series of events that occurs during the cycle. We said at the start of every month, gonadotropin releasing hormone triggers the release of gonadotropins, FSH and LH. And during the first half of the cycle, it's more FSH than LH. That stimulates growth of one or more primordial follicles. Now, these follicles, as they begin to develop, they release estrogen. Estrogen is going to exhibit a negative feedback at the level of the hypothalamus and pituitary. Okay. Now, despite the fact that levels of FSH and LH may begin to fall, during the development of these granulosa cells, they begin producing a higher and higher concentration of FSH receptors. So even though there's less FSH available due to negative feedback, there are more receptors available to pick up that FSH. So the follicle continues to develop, and as it gets larger and larger, it produces high levels of estrogen. Whereas low levels of estrogen create negative feedback, once you surpass a certain threshold in terms of estrogen concentration, a switch is flipped. And now high levels trigger positive feedback. Okay? Whereas with the negative feedback, the anterior pituitary was producing gonadotropins but not releasing them. When that threshold is surpassed, those stored gonadotropins get released. And so here, you see high levels of estrogen at stage 4. Stage 5 is then you have an LH and an FSH surge that occurs at mid-cycle. We talked about the things that the LH surge triggers. Ultimately, it leads to ovulation. Okay. and conversion of the follicular remnants into a corpus luteum. This occurs in mid-cycle. Notice that during the first half of the cycle, the primary sex hormone being released is estrogen. And that's being released from the developing follicles. During the second half of the cycle, the corpus luteum is producing both hormones, but primarily progesterone. So we can think of the corpus luteum as a type of endocrine gland. It's producing sex hormones and inhibit that as these levels increase, they exert negative feedback in the hypothalamus and pituitary. So this is just a quick synopsis. High levels of estrogen from the almost mature grafting follicle. They're going to create positive feedback, triggering release of the natural release hormone, and then an LH and FSH surge. And that surge is what triggers ovulation. All right. This is a graphic representation of the levels of various hormones throughout the cycle. We're going to divide the cycle into an ovarian cycle and a uterine cycle. The uterine cycle can also be called the menstrual cycle. With respect to the ovarian cycle, the first half prior to ovulation is called the follicular phase. Because the first half of the ovarian cycle is all about the developing follicle. Okay. Following ovulation, the follicular remnants get converted into a corpus luteum. Okay. So the second half of the ovarian cycle, those activities relate to hormones released from the corpus luteum. So that phase is called the luteal phase. And here's a little secret that very few people know. Regardless of the length of the entire cycle, the luteal phase is always 14 days. Cycles can vary. Most commonly from about 21 days to about 40 days. Let's say you have a 30-day cycle. Well, that means that ovulation is going to occur on what day? 30 minus 14. 16. Okay, so whereas the follicular phase can vary, the luteal phase is fairly constant. Now, with regard to the uterine cycle, the events that are occurring within the uterus, the first 3 to 5 days make up what's called the menstrual phase. During this phase, there's sloughing of the endometrium. That's assuming that implantation did not occur. If implantation occurs, there won't be any sloughing, there won't be any menstrual phase. Assuming that implantation does not occur, there's sloughing of the endometrium, that brings up the menstrual phase. Now, as the menstrual phase is ending, we enter into the proliferative phase, where these new follicles, stimulated by FSH, begin to release estrogen. And estrogen begins to rebuild the endometrium. So we can think of it as a new endometrium is being proliferated. And that proliferative phase extends to ovulation. And the proliferation of the endometrium is brought about by estrogen released by the follicles. But following ovulation, those follicular remnants get converted to the corpus luteum, and then the major hormone that's being secreted is progesterone. And progesterone is going to cause that new endometrium to begin to mature. It's called the secretory phase because under the influence of progesterone, the endometrial glands mature and begin secreting glycogen, which is going to be the nutrient source for the newly implanted embryo if it implants. So hence, secretory phase. Okay. So those are phases of the ovarian and the uterine cycle. Let's look and see what's occurring down here with respect to hormone levels. During the follicular phase, we have the anterior pituitary releasing FSH, and to a lesser extent, LH. You see these levels right here. And these gonadotropins are stimulating development of new follicles. Primordial follicles that were previously in the suspended state of animation, they awaken and they begin to develop. And as these follicles begin to develop, what do? They begin secreting estrogen. Now, as estrogen levels begin to climb, gonadotropin levels begin to fall. Negative feedback. However, once estrogen surpass a certain threshold, we said a switch is flipped, and now at high levels, we generate positive feedback. So now all of a sudden we have a surge of FSH and to a greater extent LH near mid-cycle. That brings about ovulation. Ovulation follows this LH surge by about 24 to 36 hours. With the LH surge, we generate a corpus luteum. Notice that corpus luteum now is producing sex hormones, but more progesterone than estrogen. Whereas the estrogens generated by the developing follicle or follicles stimulate proliferation of endometrium, this progesterone is going to stimulate maturation. Now, this corpus luteum was generated and supported by LH, luteinizing hormone. Okay? Notice that as it produces progesterone and to a lesser extent estrogen, these gonadotropin levels begin to fall. Okay. If implantation occurs, the newly implanted embryo is going to begin secreting a hormone called HCG. What is HCG? Human chorionic. Chorions are part of the embryo. The placenta. Chorionic gonadotropin. So, if implantation occurs, the new placenta begins secreting HCG. It's a gonadotropin similar to LH. Okay? And so that gonadotropin is going to continue to stimulate or maintain the corpus luteum in the absence of LH. So that particularly during the first 3 months of pregnancy, the corpus luteum is going to continue to secrete hormones that sustain the pregnancy. Now, what if implantation does not occur and HCG doesn't get secreted? Well, we can see here that because of production of the sex hormones, progesterone and estrogen with their negative feedback, LH levels and FSH levels plummet. Without that support, then what do you think is going to happen to the production of progesterone and estrogen? They're going to fall because the corpus luteum is losing its hormonal support. so it stops generating progesterone and estrogen. When you withdraw progesterone, that's going to be the trigger for sloughing of the endometrium. That's going to cause the endometrium to slough. And when it sloughs, then you have the beginning of the menstrual cycle, a new menstrual cycle. You have the menstrual phase. Okay, so the cycle repeats itself.
You said that the corpus luteum, like without implantation, it doesn't have that hormonal support.
So, what does birth control have an effect on this?
Well, because, you know, when you give birth control, it depends, the pills are all different. But a lot of times, if you take like a 28-day pill, first 14 days may have estrogen. Next, and it depends because that's a mixture, every pill is different. All right, estrogen and progesterone, but then it's not uncommon to have estrogen for 14 days and 7 days of progesterone and progesterone plus estrogen, and those last 7 pills are just placebo. So in other words, they stimulate development of the endometrium, maturation of the endometrium, and then they withdraw progesterone. And so what happens? And you slough, and you have a menstrual cycle.
Right.
Okay? But because throughout the 28-day cycle, particularly at 21 days, you're getting estrogen and or progesterone, that's inhibiting release of gonadotropins from the pituitary. Without release of gonadotropins, you're inhibiting development of any new follicles. You can take a birth control pill. So you're not producing new follicles. If you're not producing new follicles, you're not going to ovulate. So you don't ovulate. Everybody with me on all this? Okay. Now, we talked about a lot of couples, if they want to achieve fertility, they have to time ovulation. There's a number of ways that you can do it. One is using what's called a Spin-Markite sign. It turns out that there are changes in the mucus that occur during the menstrual cycle.